Hello, I'm Charna Davis Wiese. It has all the trappings of great film, families, communities, struggling to either keep or better their lives, the lives they need and love, banding together, fighting each other. It's the story of the history of the Southern farmer, and it's just one of the things we're going to talk about today with Dr. Connie Lester. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here.
You know, I am so excited about learning about this from you. We were getting to know each other before the show, and I am a city girl, definitely. And until I married a country boy and got to know the people in his farming community and learned the lives they live, I never realized how difficult it is, how much is out of their control.
Yes.
And when I think of the people in the past and how much more they had to struggle with, I can't even imagine that these entire generations and communities of farmers stayed at it, kept at it.
Well, when you think about it, there weren't many options originally. Most people ended up farming because there was lots of land. It was something that most people had experience with from childhood on. And so it was sort of a natural way for men to support their families and support themselves. When you think about farming, it changed dramatically in the 19th century. If you looked at 1790, for instance, as the United States was beginning to become a constitutional nation, and the founders of that nation thought of farmers as the epitome of the American man. If we were going to have a constitutional government, and if it was going to succeed, it would succeed because men were independent farmers. They owned their own land. They could make political decisions without coercion. By the end of the 19th century, 100 years later, farmers were being called rubes and hayseeds, and there was this sense in which those who were farmers were backward. Those who were intelligent and capable had moved to the cities and were engaged in a new urban life. And farming itself had changed. If you looked at the 1790s, people farmed in pretty much the same way they had farmed for hundreds of years. But by the time you get to the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, farming is not something that someone can do simply because they have land. They now need capital to invest in plows and reapers and special seeds and fertilizers. If you were farming on the Great Plains, it really was commercial agriculture. And needing that capital meant that they had to farm commercially. Before, men had produced things for the market, but generally what they did was to provide for their families, food and fiber for their families.
It wasn't
first.
as much a cash crop as something they needed to survive.
If they had extra, they marketed the surplus. But now they need to farm commercially, and it means they have to buy many of the things that they formerly produced on the farm, and that changes everything.
And it was really way back in history when they realized in Roanoke and in Virginia, when they didn't plan, when the gentlemen came from England and they didn't plan on food and they didn't farm, and they what did they call it, the starving time?
Yes.
Because they didn't have food for the winter?
That's right.
They realized
That's right.
how important it is.
It is, and it's not just a matter of food. In order to farm commercially, you've got to be able to have enough labor to support the farm itself. You can plant 900 acres, but if you only have the labor to harvest 100 acres, you know,
you're going to give it to the crows.
You're going to give it to the crows. That's right. So labor is an important factor as well.
So you have a book, and it's called, I love the title, Up from the Mud Sills of Hell.
Yes.
About what happened and the controversy and the things that were going on in the South that changed farming forever. Where did you come up with the title?
The title comes from a speech that was given in Obion County in northwestern Tennessee in 1892. The speech was given by a man who was very much opposed to the farmers as political actors. Farmers in 1892 in Tennessee were pushed out of the Democratic Party, and formed a separate People's Party, which was a national party. We know it better as the Populist Party. And he believed that the populists were out to undermine everything that the nation stood for. So he's in the throes of this speech, and he says to his audience, if you wanted to find populists, you would look for them under the mudsills of hell. And I love that. I love that quote. And so as I was working on the book, it seemed to me that historians have pretty much left those farmers under the mudsills of hell. They talk about the failure of the Populist Party, and it did fail. In the 1896 election, farmers, the Populist Party allied with the Democratic Party to support William Jennings Bryan. And it is essentially the end of the Populist Party. But from my perspective, as I thought about it, I wondered what happened to those farmers. Did they just go home and say, well, you know, that's that, you know, we'll just go back to doing what we've always done, you know, too bad for us. And what I found out was, no, they didn't. They're still around for a long time. They're no longer a political party. The Democrats in Tennessee worried about the populists for well into the 20th century, and you can find evidence that they tried to count how many populists were still in the county, you know, so they would know how to assess the vote or the potential vote. But more than that, many of the things that the populists stood for end up being implemented as law and as constitutional amendments in the 20th century. And those populists themselves, I found, at least in Tennessee, become embedded in the new agricultural bureaucracy that emerges. They're in the Tennessee Department of Agriculture. They're in the Agricultural Extension Service. They're in the USDA. And so their influence is still there. And in fact, two of those old populists end up in Florida as assistant commissioners of agriculture under Nathan Mayo. So they have influence, but the influence is not so obvious. So leaving them under the mudsills of hell doesn't serve us well in understanding that
Why
past.
were the powers that be, why were they so threatened by the farmers?
The political situation in the late 19th century was very much like our political situation at the moment. The parties were pretty evenly divided, and when you look at when you look at Congress in that time, most of the time you have the Democrats holding one house of Congress, the Republicans holding the other. Seldom, in fact only 2 or 3 times, do you have a situation where you have the president and both houses of Congress from the same party. And what that means is, as we know from our own experience, is that you have gridlock, because people who are in political office are skeptical of making the kinds of changes that need to be made, of addressing the issues that need to be addressed, because to do so may mean that they won't be reelected. And this is what had happened in the 19th century. There were a number of critical issues that had to be addressed in the late 19th century, and politicians didn't want to do that. So you have farmers, and they ally themselves loosely with workers in factories who are facing similar problems, to begin to push for change. And the kinds of changes they needed were those that addressed the economy of the time, the currency and banking of the time, and the way in which the political process was carried out. And they look at a number of solutions. They believe that in this emergence, this is a period in which you have the emergence of industrial capitalism. People were familiar with manufacturing. They were familiar at some level with industrialism. But the industrial capitalism of the late 19th century created a situation where you had a very, very wealthy few and a lot of very poor. And they began to worry, farmers worried, that what that would mean was that they would no longer be actors in the political process. Their vote wouldn't count for anything. And they had no real access to the political powers. And they began to look for ways to change that. So they proposed a number of things. One of the most important things they proposed was that the Senate, which at that point was not elected by popular vote, and hadn't been from the beginnings of the Republic, they began to press for the popular election of senators, which was not implemented in their time, but was implemented in 1913. That was one of the things they pushed for. They pushed for changes in the national banking and changes in the currency. We were not officially on a gold standard, but we were effectively on a gold standard, and that meant that there was a depression of farm prices. And so they wanted the reinstitution of bimetallism in order to have a modest inflation and raise farm prices.
What's interesting is during the fight, when they saw that this was not going to be easy,
right,
some became more determined, but some not only gave up, they turned against the ones who they thought they were on the same side as originally,
right,
didn't they?
Yes, it's not just, you know, everyone doesn't buy into the ideology and support it from start to finish. And there were a number of alternatives, a number of ways in which these farmers didn't go to the political heart of the matter initially. In fact, what they tried to do was address the problem themselves, and they wanted to address it with cooperative marketing and cooperative buying, so that they would control the cost of the inputs into farming, and they could, by marketing cooperatively, they could raise the prices, they hoped. That never worked out very well. They didn't have the financial backing to make it a success. They're competing with already established houses, and so it doesn't work. And they move more and more into the political arena. And many of the people who knew that changes had to be made were more and more skeptical about moving into the political arena, especially in the South. They had just gone through a civil war and Reconstruction. They were fearful of bringing in the federal government to make changes. They had established essentially a one-party South. That was never altogether the case, but essentially they had a one-party South. And they were fearful, in their own words, of undermining the party of the fathers, as they called it. And so there were a number of people who were skeptical of this. They were skeptical of the motivations of some of the leaders. So you had people who moved in and out of the farm movement. It was never a fully cohesive movement.
And you know what? We have so much more to talk about, but we'll be right back in just a few moments.
Greatness doesn't care how early it is or how late. Greatness doesn't care if anyone's watching. Greatness doesn't care about your clothes, your hair, or your music. The only thing greatness cares about is getting an opportunity. Where will you get yours? At UCF, we believe no dream is too big and no goal out of reach. On the fields, the courts, and in the classrooms, UCF stands for opportunity.
We're here, we're talking with Dr. Connie Lester. We're talking about the history of farming in the South and the struggles that the farmers had to get into the political arena and make life better for them, which essentially made life better for everybody else. You talk about that all of this was happening after Reconstruction, after the Civil War.
Right.
But didn't they reach across racial lines and class lines and gender to work together to get the changes they needed, which is kind of an ironic union to accomplish what they needed to do?
They did. And at some level, it's a very pragmatic union. You have to recognize the limitations of that union. They're not necessarily talking about racial equality when they make those kinds of connections across racial lines. And Southern farmers were more reluctant when it came to promoting women. But women were always a part of the farm movement, and this begins as early as the Grange movement. The Grangers required in the establishment of a local grange, you had to have women in the grange. You could not just have an all-male organization. So the Farmers Alliance and the Agricultural Wheel, which were two of the successive organizations, did not require women, but women were very much a part of most of the granges, and women, or most of the alliances and the wheels, and women stood up and demanded that they be part of that. Now, when you see that, you have to realize that there are limitations to it. Some of those women who stood up and said, you know, you should not have a wheel or alliance without women, because women are a vital part of farm life, also were reluctant to claim their rights as voters. So, you know, it had its limitations. But it's very progressive in the way in which it was more inclusive. It included oftentimes factory workers, the Knights of Labor, which was an early labor organization, was very closely tied to the Farmers Alliance and often made common cause together. And so what you have to understand when you're looking at these people is how progressive they are, and at the same time what the limitations are. They're still bound by the feelings of their own time.
They have their needs, yet they're struggling with their culture. Let's talk about some of the other things you've done. Tell me about this Turpentine Camp. I didn't even know there was such a thing as a Turpentine Camp, and yet we have one on campus.
Apparently we do. Not long after I arrived on the UCF campus, a man who works over at Siemens asked me if I knew anything about a Turpentine Camp on campus, and I said, no, I really don't. So he took us over there. Myself and Dr. Casanello in the department went over to look at it. And there were a number of artifacts there. And Dr. Casanello put up a blog and asked people to help identify the things. And turpentiners are like reenactors in some ways. You know, we began to have emails from all over identifying the various artifacts that were there. So we began to look at turpentining in this area, and it turns out there were a number of turpentine camps in the...
what is that, a turpentine camp?
What they're collecting turpentine for naval stores and processing it. It was one of the areas where farmers could expand and take in extra income. And often turpentine workers were African American workers as well. Collecting turpentine and processing it for naval stores was a very important industry in the late 19th and the early 20th century. So we found these artifacts on the UCF campus. It apparently was not a large turpentine camp, but they are scattered out across the South. And again, it was one of the ways in which farming also bled over into industrial processing, and it was one of the ways in which people made money off their land.
How did you end up in history starting in microbiology? How'd that happen?
Well, the short answer to that is evolution. But there's a longer, more complicated answer to that. I was always interested in history. My father was in the military. And we spent some time stationed in France. And my father was determined that we would get the most out of our experience. So he took us to places every weekend. And as children, one weekend a month, we had to determine where we were going and make a case for why we were going there. And that was
a brilliant parent thing.
Oh, it was brilliant. It was brilliant.
He doesn't have to think of it, and he makes it educational at the same time. I don't have to write that one.
It was brilliant. It was brilliant. And so we went to, we went everywhere. And as children, we all three became very interested in the world around us and in France. I was always interested in history. But when I was in high school and I was thinking about going to college, I originally thought I would be a historian. And people said, oh, you'll never make money in history, you can't be a historian. And I was good in science. I had been interested in science as well. And so I went to college. I majored in microbiology. I minored in chemistry. And I am not the least bit sorry I did. I worked at the University of Tennessee Medical School, worked on cholera research there, and then went to St. Jude Children's Hospital and did research there as well. So I start out as a microbiologist, but I'm always interested in history. And I took some time out when my children were small to take care of my children. And when I came back, you know, a few years out of the sciences is a lifetime out of the sciences.
Right, a few months.
A few months, yes, absolutely. So when I thought about what I was going to do with the rest of my life, I decided I was a big girl. I could do what I wanted to do. So I decided I would start over and be a historian. And I have really enjoyed it. And my microbiology has served me well. I do agricultural history. And my microbiology has served me well in that
Tell
regard.
us about this little guy, the dog.
This little dog was from my time in France. It was one of the first things I bought when I was in France, and it has been very important to my life. And so I have the little dog as part of my my process of understanding my life. And in France was again where I was able to come to the history, to understand the history. And I brought a second artifact that shows you the way in which your childhood sort of sets you on the path of who you become later. So in France, this is my symbol of coming to understand history, literally from the ground up. You know, we went everywhere and we did everything. And when I came back, I was in a school in El Paso, Texas, and I had a professor who had at the back of the room, he had, and the other show and tell I brought was a National Geographic. At the back of the room, he had years and years and years of National Geographics. And when
His wife probably made him get him out of the house.
Probably so. And when you didn't have anything to do, you went back and looked at the National Geographic. And each of us became experts in our own areas. I was the medieval expert from reading about things in the National Geographic. And the thing you did then was to make presentations from the things that you had learned in the National Geographic. So it kind of solidified the importance of history for me and what I would become as I moved forward. And this professor was very important to me. He came to my family and told them that he thought I should go to college. And it was really the first time I'd thought about going to college. And so in many ways, I became who I am because of that particular teacher.
And that's a wonderful thing, to have someone, one person in your life
Absolutely.
that gives you what I like to call the aha moment. I can do that.
I can do that,
That's
yes.
something I could do. And you mentioned something that you heard from your parents that I'm sure a lot of people hear. I was telling one of the dean of the College of Arts and Humanities that I was so interested in philosophy. Mm-hmm. And my mother says there's no openings for Socrates, you know.
That's right.
What are you going to open a store and sell ideas, you know? And that might be what some kids are thinking today. Is there a career in history? And obviously the answer is yes.
Yes, absolutely. And there are lots of different kinds of careers. And I've had several of them, as a matter of fact, even in history. There are those who teach in universities or in high school or other places. Most historians write at some level articles or books. There is also public history. My sister is a public historian, in fact, and public historians manage house museums, other kinds of museums. There is editing, and I also edit. I'm the editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly.
Tell us about that. I didn't even know that existed till I met you.
Well, and I brought
and you just happen to have one.
I brought a Florida Historical Quarterly with me. Most states have a state historical quarterly. There are also regional historical quarterlies, individual disciplines. There are national and international historical quarterlies. I'm on the editorial board of Agricultural History, which publishes, as its name implies, agricultural history. And they publish articles, they publish book reviews, those sorts of things. And I began in the editorial process, actually, while I was in graduate school. I served as a time on the editing of the James K. Polk papers. The 19th century presidents' papers are edited at universities generally. 20th century presidents have their own libraries, but not 19th century presidents. So I worked on the James K. Polk papers, editing those papers for publication. Then I went to the, while I was still in graduate school, as I was working on my dissertation, I was the associate editor for the Tennessee Encyclopedia Project. And then I have come to the Florida Historical Society, editing their quarterly, which is housed at the University of Central Florida.
Well, you've touched so many things. My question to you is, and it's probably one of these questions you're going to think, I don't know, what is she asking me this for, is what do you think tomorrow's history is going to be? What is it today that people are going to be saying, now this is the one thing, or this is one of the group of things that really changed the world?
Well, you know, there's this old saying in history, it's not history till it's at least 100 years old. So I'm getting on really thin ice. I'm on thin ice when I say this. But I think that, you know, the kind of history I do is in some ways people's history, in the sense that I look at farmers, I look at farm wives. I look at the people who oftentimes were never elected to office, who never wrote a book, who never, in a real sense, people will say, well, how do you even know about them? But I think that in our own time, we have so many more opportunities to make our ideas known to a larger audience. With the blogs that people have, with the way in which they communicate with one another over enormous distances. So I think it will be hard to say exactly. The political process has certainly been affected by our ability to speak with one another. But I think that in many ways, rather than the political decisions that are made at the top, I think that there's the possibility that our history will be more written by ordinary folks who have an opportunity to make their views known, sometimes in the political process and sometimes in what they write to one another.
And I think being that we have that technology, the historians of the future will have a much easier job than you do.
Yes and no. Yes and no. We don't keep letters anymore.
That's true. That's true. Dr. Connie Lester, I'm so sorry we ran out of time. We have so much to talk about, but thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
I'm Charna Davis Wiese. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again next time on UCF Profiles.